My name is Anya, and I'll never forget the night my in-laws made my parents sit in the corner on folding chairs at their anniversary dinner, serving them on chipped plates while the real guests dined at the main table. My father builds homes with his hands. My mother worked double shifts to put me through college, but to the Whitmore family, they were nothing more than an embarrassment to be hidden away. What the Whitmores didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for 3 years, and by the time dessert was served, everything would change. If you are watching this video right now, I would love to know where you are from. Drop it in the comments section below. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about family relationships that take unexpected turns. My name is Anya, and I need to tell you about the night everything changed, the night my parents were humiliated, and the night I finally fought back.
But first, let me tell you about them.
My father, Thomas, is a carpenter whose hands have built more homes than most people will ever live in. Those hands are rough, calloused from decades of honest work, but they're the same hands that taught me to ride a bike, that applauded at every school play, that wiped away my tears when the world felt too heavy. My mother, Elena, worked double shifts at the hospital laundry for 30 years. Her back aches constantly now, but she never complained, not once, about the sacrifices she made so I could have piano lessons, summer camps, and eventually college. They gave me everything while keeping nothing for themselves. Mom still wears the same church dress she bought for my high school graduation 15 years ago. Dad's best shoes have been resold 3 times. But if you ask them about their lives, they'll tell you they're the richest people in the world because they have each other and they have me. I wish I could say my husband's family sees that wealth, but they don't. They can't. The Whitmore family, old money, old traditions, old prejudices, measures worth in stock portfolios and country club memberships. My mother-in-law, Ruth Whitmore, traces her lineage back to railroad barons. She once told me, with no trace of irony, that breeding shows. My father-in-law, Charles, built his fortune in commercial real estate, though if you listen carefully to the stories, you realize he mostly built upon what he inherited. From the moment James introduced me to them 5 years ago, I knew I didn't belong in their world. Ruth's first words to me, after a lengthy up-and-down assessment, were, "Well, aren't you refreshing?" The way she said refreshing made it sound like a disease. Every family gathering since has been an exercise in subtle degradation, comments about my quaint childhood stories, surprise that I knew which fork to use, gentle suggestions about upgrading my wardrobe. James tries to buffer their condescension, but he's caught between 2 worlds. He loves me, I know he does, but he's also their son, raised in their bubble, trained from birth to avoid confrontation with a family that controls his trust fund. 3 weeks ago, the invitation arrived. Thick cream cardstock with gold embossing, it announced the Whitmores' 40th wedding anniversary dinner. An intimate gathering of family and cherished friends, it read. What caught my eye was the handwritten note from Ruth at the bottom. Do bring your parents, Anya. It's time we all got better acquainted. My stomach dropped. In 5 years, Ruth had never once suggested meeting my parents. The timing felt deliberate. She knew I'd been promoted to senior partner at my firm, knew that James and I were trying for a baby. Perhaps she wanted to remind me where I came from before I got too comfortable. But my parents were thrilled. Mom called me 3 times that day, each time with a new question. Should I get my hair done professionally? Is my navy dress too casual? What do rich people talk about at dinner? Just be yourselves, I told them, though the words felt hollow. Being themselves was exactly what the Whitmores would punish them for. The week before the dinner, I watched my parents prepare with heartbreaking earnestness. Dad spent an entire Saturday afternoon polishing his 20-year-old dress shoes until they gleamed. He even bought new laces. Mom went to 3 different stores looking for the right purse. Not too big, not too small, something that says I belong there, she explained. She finally settled on a simple black clutch from Target, $19.99, which she thought looked expensive. We just want them to like us, Mom said the night before the dinner, practicing her posture in front of the mirror. We want them to know we raised you right. They already know that. I lied. The Whitmore estate sits on 40 acres in Westchester County, a monument to generational wealth. As we drove through the gates that evening, my parents fell silent. The main house, they call it a house, though mansion would be more accurate, glowed against the October twilight, every window blazing with warm light. "It looks like something from a movie," Dad whispered. "It is something from a movie," I replied. "They rented it out for a Netflix series last year." We were greeted at the door by actual servants. The Whitmores employed a full staff for the evening. My parents exchanged glances, unsure whether to shake hands or simply nod. The butler, trained to ignore such awkwardness, simply took our coats with practiced efficiency. The dining hall was a masterpiece of conspicuous consumption. A table that could seat 30 stretched beneath 3 massive chandeliers. Every place setting involved more silverware than my parents owned in total. Orchid centerpieces, flown in that morning from Ecuador, perfumed the air with expensive sweetness. "Oh my," Mom breathed, her hand finding Dad's arm. "Tom, look at the ceiling." Dad tilted his head back to study the hand-painted fresco above, cherubs and clouds in the Italian style. "That's real gold leaf in the details," he murmured, professional appreciation breaking through his nervousness. "Must have taken months to complete." The room was already half full when we entered. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned our way. Ruth's sister Margaret actually raised her opera glasses, to examine my parents from across the room. James's cousins, Bradley and Constance, exchanged smirks that they didn't bother to hide. Ruth glided toward us in a dress that probably cost more than my parents' car. "Anya, darling," she said, air-kissing my cheeks while her eyes remained fixed on my parents. "And you must be the parents. Not Anya's parents. Not Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. Just the parents, like they were items on an inventory list." "Tom Peterson," my dad said, extending his hand. "Thank you for having us, Mrs. Whitmore. Your home is breathtaking." Ruth touched his hand briefly, the way you might handle something sticky. "How genuine of you to say so." She turned to my mother. "And your Ellen?" "Elena," Mom corrected gently. "Of course." Ruth's smile could have frozen champagne. "Well, we should get everyone seated. The evening's program is quite full." She led us toward the table, her heels clicking against marble. My parents walked carefully, Mom clutching her Target purse like a lifeline. I watched other guests watch them, taking in Dad's off-the-rack suit, Mom's dress from a decade past fashion, their obvious discomfort in this temple to excess. "Now then," Ruth announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We've had to make some adjustments to the seating arrangement. The main table is completely full with immediate family and special guests." She gestured toward the back corner of the room, where 2 folding chairs had been placed near the service entrance. "Tom and Ellen." "Elena," I corrected, my voice sharp. "Elena, yes. You'll be comfortable over there. The view of the room is actually quite good." A ripple of laughter, soft, knowing, cruel, passed through the assembled guests. I saw Bradley elbow his wife. Margaret lowered her opera glasses, satisfied with what she'd witnessed. My father's face went through a transformation I'll never forget. First confusion, then understanding, then a deep, crushing hurt that he immediately tried to hide. His shoulders, broad from years of physical labor, seemed to collapse inward. He looked at the folding chairs, then at the elaborate place settings at the main table, then down at his carefully polished shoes. That's fine," he said quietly. "We don't need—" "It's perfect," Mom interrupted, her voice bright and false. She took Dad's arm and squeezed it. "We're just happy to be here." They walked to their corner, my proud parents, made small by design. Mom pulled out her own chair, no servant rushed to help them, and sat down with her purse in her lap. Dad sat beside her, his hands flat on his thighs like he didn't know where else to put them. I stood frozen, rage building in my chest like a physical thing. James appeared at my elbow, his face carefully neutral. "Anya, come on. Our seats are ready." "Did you know?" I whispered. "Know what?" "The folding chairs. The corner. Did you know?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. I looked at my place card at the main table. elegant calligraphy on thick cardstock, positioned between James and his Aunt Victoria. Then I looked at my parents, already forgotten in their corner, trying to make themselves smaller, less visible, less of an embarrassment to the people who had decided they didn't deserve dignity. Inside my head, a voice that sounded like my mother's said, "Don't make a scene. Don't give them the satisfaction." But another voice, harder and clearer, said something else entirely. "They want a war. Give them one." I took my seat at the main table, smoothing my napkin across my lap with steady hands. I smiled at Victoria when she commented on my brave choice of jewelry, so minimalist, she said, meaning so cheap. I nodded when Charles began his toast about family legacy and the importance of maintaining standards. And I began to plan. The appetizers arrived with choreographed precision, servers sweeping in from hidden doors, plates descending simultaneously at the main table, like some kind of culinary ballet. Seared foie gras with a port wine reduction, microgreens arranged with tweezers, edible flowers that cost more per ounce than gold. I watched the server approach my parents' corner with two different plates, smaller portions on obviously older china, one with a visible chip on the rim. My mother noticed the chip immediately. I saw her run her finger along it, then carefully rotate the plate so it faced away from the room. She folded and refolded her napkin, a nervous habit from childhood, trying to occupy her hands so they wouldn't shake. My father hadn't touched his fork. He was staring at the elaborate spread before the chosen ones at the main table, perhaps calculating how many hours of labor each plate represented. "The foie gras is from our favorite supplier in Perigord," Ruth announced to the table, though her voice carried deliberately to the corners. "Charles and I discovered him on our last trip to France." Of course, not everyone appreciates such delicacies. Some palates are more accustomed to simpler fare. Margaret tittered. "Remember when the Johnsons brought that dreadful casserole to the club potluck? Some people simply don't understand cuisine." "Speaking of the club," Bradley interjected, swirling his wine, "did you all hear about the new membership requirements? They're trying to maintain a certain caliber." The conversation was a masterclass in coded cruelty. Every anecdote, every shared reference, was designed to build walls between those who belonged and those who didn't. They discussed vacation homes in the Hamptons, compared notes on private school admissions, debated the merits of different yacht clubs. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. My father, God bless him, tried to find an opening. During a brief pause, he cleared his throat. "The craftsmanship in this room is extraordinary," he offered, his voice carrying across the space. "The crown molding is hand-carved, isn't it? That's a lost art these days." Charles looked up from his plate with an expression of mild surprise, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. "I wouldn't know," he said dismissively. "We had people handle all that." "Dad's a master carpenter," I said, my voice cutting through the awkward silence. "He's built over 200 homes in the tri-state area. Real homes, where real families make real memories." "How industrious," Ruth said, the word dripping with condescension. "Though, I suppose someone has to do that sort of work." "The sort of work that built this country," I replied, but Ruth had already turned away, launching into a story about their recent charity gala where they'd raised significant funds. She emphasized the word, for deserving causes. James squeezed my hand under the table. A warning.
A plea.
But his touch felt weak, insubstantial. Where was his voice? Where was the man who claimed to love me, who'd promised to stand by me? He sat there, cutting his foie gras into precise squares, a study in privileged paralysis. "Thomas, was it?" Constance called out suddenly, her voice carrying a false sweetness. "What exactly does a carpenter make these days? I'm just curious about, different lifestyles." My father's jaw tightened. "I make enough." "Enough for what, exactly?" Bradley added with a smirk. "I mean, clearly not enough for proper dinner attire." The laughter that followed was no longer soft. It was open, brazen. My mother's face flushed deep red. She reached for her water glass with trembling fingers and knocked it over. The water spread across the small table, dripping onto her dress. "Oh," she gasped, jumping up. No one moved to help. The servers, who had been so attentive to the main table, seemed to have disappeared. Mom used her carefully folded napkin to dab at the spill, apologizing to no one and everyone. "How clumsy of me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps," Ruth said loudly, "this is why we maintain certain standards about seating arrangements. Some people simply aren't comfortable in refined settings." That's when my father broke his silence. "My wife," he said, his voice steady despite everything, "has more grace in her little finger than—" "Tom," Mom interrupted, touching his arm.
Please.
"It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. "You know what I find fascinating?" I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "How people who've never built anything with their own hands, never cleaned their own homes, never cooked their own meals, somehow think they're superior to those who do." Ruth's eyebrows rose. "Anya, dear, you seem upset. Perhaps you should." "I'm not upset," I said calmly.
I'm observant.
"For instance, I observed that you had 2 empty chairs at this main table. The Harringtons' places, weren't they? They canceled yesterday. Yet my parents are sitting on folding chairs in the corner. That's not about space. That's about cruelty." "How dare you?" Margaret began. "How dare I what? Point out the obvious? Challenge the narrative? Refuse to watch my parents be humiliated for your entertainment?" The room had gone silent except for the soft clink of Bradley setting down his wine glass. James finally spoke, his voice weak. "Anya, please. This isn't the time." "When is the time, James?" "When your mother suggests my parents eat in the kitchen. When she asks them to use the service elevator." Ruth stood, her composure cracking slightly. "If you cannot maintain proper decorum, propedacurum." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you call this elaborate performance of degradation?" I pulled out my phone, keeping it low but visible. "Should we talk about proper decorum? About the text you sent to Margaret 3 hours ago?" I didn't read it aloud, not yet, but Ruth's face went pale. She knew exactly which message I meant. The one where she called my parents, the help, and joked about making them wear name tags so people wouldn't confuse them for actual guests. "You went through my—" "No," I said simply. "Margaret sent it to Constance, who left her phone unlocked on the powder room counter. Amazing what people leave lying around when they think everyone around them is beneath notice." My mother stood up in her corner, her wet dress clinging to her legs. "Anya, sweetheart, don't. We should go."
No, Mom.
"You shouldn't have to go. You were invited here. You deserve to be treated with basic human respect." "Respect is earned," Charles interjected, finding his voice now that his wife was under attack. "You're right," I said, turning to face him. "So tell me, Charles, what exactly did you do to earn your respect? Besides being born into the right family and marrying into more money." "How dare?" That's the second time someone's asked how I dare tonight. How I dare is simple. I love my parents. I respect what they've built with their hands and their hearts. And I'm done, completely done, pretending that this room full of inherited wealth and purchased pedigrees has any moral authority to judge them. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "You want to know the difference between my parents and all of you? They've never had to make someone else feel small to feel big themselves." Ruth's composure finally shattered. "Get out. All of you. Get out of my home." "Gladly," I said. "But first," I held up my phone. "We're going to finish this conversation. Because I have a few more observations about this family's standards that I think everyone should hear." "You have nothing," Ruth hissed. "Don't I?" I smiled, and for the first time all evening, I saw fear flicker in her eyes. "Why don't we find out? After all, dessert hasn't been served yet. And I always heard the Whitmores never leave a dinner unfinished." The servers had reappeared, hovering uncertainly with their dessert trays. The room held its breath. My parents stood frozen in their corner, torn between pride in my defiance and horror at the scene unfolding. James finally stood, positioning himself between his mother and me. "Enough," he said, but I couldn't tell who he was talking to. "You're right," I said. Enough is enough. So, let's end this properly. I walked across the room to my parents, my heels clicking against the marble with the same sharp confidence Ruth had demonstrated earlier. I took my mother's damp hand in my left, my father's calloused palm in my right. These are my parents, I announced to the room. Thomas and Elena Peterson. They are the best people I know. And if this table isn't good enough for them, then it's not good enough for me. Then leave, Ruth spat. Oh, I will, I said. But first, let me share something with everyone. A little story about standards and propriety and the things people do when they think no one's watching. I released my parents' hands gently, giving them a reassuring squeeze before I reached for my phone again. The room watched with a mixture of anticipation and dread, some guests leaning forward despite themselves, others shrinking back as if distance might protect them from whatever was coming. You know what I've learned in 5 years of attending these gatherings? I asked, my voice conversational, almost pleasant. Rich people document everything. Every transaction, every communication, every little deal and favor. You just assume your secrets are safe because you all have dirt on each other. Mutually assured destruction, right? Ruth's sister Margaret shifted uncomfortably. Bradley's smirk had faded entirely. But here's the thing, I continued, walking slowly back toward the main table. I'm not part of your mutual destruction pact. I'm just the girl from the wrong side of town who married up, remember? The one you all whispered about at the wedding, wondering how long it would last, taking bets on when James would come to his senses. Anya, James warned, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew I'd passed the point of no return. No, honey, I said, not unkindly. You had your chance to speak up. Every time your mother insulted me, every time your family made those little cutting remarks, every time they acted like I was a stain on your family tree, you said nothing. So now I'll speak. I pulled up a folder on my phone labeled insurance. I'd been building it for 3 years, ever since Ruth had accidentally forgotten to invite me to the family Easter gathering. Let's start with something recent, I said, projecting my voice like I was giving a presentation, which, in a way, I was. Bradley, you were just bragging about that amazing real estate deal last month. The Riverside property? Such a steal at $3 million under market value. Bradley's face went red. That was a legitimate. Was it? Because I have here a very interesting email chain between you and Councilman Davies. Dated 2 weeks before the property went on the market. You know, the same Councilman Davies whose rezoning proposal would triple the land value? The proposal that hasn't been made public yet. The room gasped. Actually gasped, like something out of a melodrama. That's, you can't prove. Bradley stammered. I don't have to prove anything, I said calmly. I'm not the SEC. But they might be interested in these screenshots, don't you think? Especially the one where you promised Davies a finder's fee through your shell company in the Caymans. Charles stood up abruptly. This is blackmail. No, I corrected. Blackmail would be if I asked for something in return for my silence. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just sharing information. Transparency, right? Isn't that what you're always preaching at those charity boards, Charles? I swiped to a new screen. Speaking of charity boards, should we discuss the Whitmore Foundation? Such generous people, giving back to the community. Except, I paused for effect. 40% of the foundation's disbursements last year went to companies owned by family members. That's not charity. That's tax evasion. You little, Margaret started. Careful, I warned. You're about to say something you'll regret. Especially since I have your text messages to your pharmaceutical friend about getting early access to anxiety medication for your son's performance issues at Princeton. The same son who's supposedly on the dean's list. Margaret's mouth snapped shut. My mother stepped forward from the corner, her voice shaking. Anya, stop. This isn't you. You're right, Mom, I said, turning to her. This isn't me. I'm not cruel. I don't take pleasure in hurting people. But they need to understand something. I faced the room again. My parents might not have trust funds or stock portfolios or summer houses. But they have integrity. They pay their taxes, all of them. They've never cheated anyone. They've never stepped on others to get ahead. Can anyone at this main table say the same? Silence. That's what I thought, I said. Ruth, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. Her voice was low, dangerous. You think you're clever, don't you? You think you've won something here? I think, I said carefully, that we need to redefine what winning looks like. I walked over to the projection screen the Whitmores used for their pretentious slideshow presentations during dinner parties. With a few taps on my phone, I connected to it. The room watched as documents began to appear, emails, text messages, bank statements. 3 months ago, I was appointed to handle a merger for my firm. Boring corporate stuff, right? Except one of the companies involved was Whitmore Real Estate Holdings. And Charles, you really should have been more careful about which lawyers had access to your files. Charles's face had gone from red to white. Those are confidential. Were confidential, I corrected. Until your assistant accidentally CC'd me on that very interesting email to your Bermuda account manager. You know, the one about the special project funding that somehow never appeared on any official books. James grabbed my arm. Anya, stop. Please. I looked at him, really looked at him. My husband, the man I'd loved for 5 years, who I'd thought was different from his family. But standing there, he looked just like them. Worried about scandal, about appearances, about anything except the fact that his parents had deliberately humiliated mine. You want me to stop? I asked him. Then make them apologize. Real apologies. To my parents. Right now. This is ridiculous, Ruth interjected. We will not be held hostage by. By what? I challenged. By the truth? By consequences? By someone who won't just smile and take your abuse. I turned back to the screen, where a new document had appeared. This is my favorite, I said. An invoice from 2 hours ago. Ruth, you paid the catering staff extra to serve my parents on the chipped plates. You literally paid money to ensure they'd be humiliated. There's even a note. Visible distinction required for corner table service. Several of the younger cousins exchanged uncomfortable looks. Even in this family, that level of deliberate cruelty was apparently a step too far. You planned every detail, I continued. The folding chairs, you had them brought in specially. They're not even from this house. The corner placement, far from the bathrooms, so they'd have to walk past everyone. The chipped plates, the smaller portions, the way you instructed the staff to ignore them. This wasn't casual thoughtlessness. This was orchestrated humiliation. My father finally spoke from his corner, his voice strong and clear. Why? Everyone turned to look at him. I need to understand, he continued, standing up slowly. What did we do to deserve this? We came here with open hearts. We were excited to meet you, to be part of your family. We wore our best clothes. We practiced what to say. My wife spent 3 days worrying about which purse to bring. So tell me, why? The silence that followed was deafening. Ruth opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. For once, she had no cutting remark ready. I'll tell you why, I said softly. Because they're afraid. They're terrified that someone might notice that underneath all this. I gestured around the opulent room. They're no better than anyone else. Maybe worse, because at least my parents earned what they have. That's enough, Charles said, but his voice was weak, uncertain. You're right, I agreed. It is enough. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to my parents. You're going to seat them at this main table, in your seats, actually, since you seem so concerned about hierarchy. And we're going to finish this dinner with the dignity and respect that should have been there from the start. Or, Ruth managed, trying to salvage some authority. Or, I said, holding up my phone. I hit send on the email I've prepared to the IRS, the SEC, and the New York Times. Your choice. The room erupted. Voices raised in anger, in panic, in recrimination. But I wasn't listening to them anymore. I was watching my parents, my beautiful, dignified parents, stand a little straighter, hold their heads a little higher. Oh, I added, raising my voice over the chaos. And one more thing. Margaret, that affair you're having with your trainer? Your husband already knows. He hired a private investigator 6 months ago. He's just waiting for your prenup clause to kick in next month." Margaret let out a strangled cry and turned to her husband, who sat stone-faced, confirming my words with his silence. "How's that for entertainment?" I asked the room. "Still feeling superior? Still think you're better than the carpenter and the laundry worker?" Ruth stood on shaking legs. "You've destroyed everything." "No," I said firmly. "I've revealed everything. There's a difference." I walked back to my parents and took their hands again. "We're going to sit down now. At the main table. All three of us. And if anyone has a problem with that, I have plenty more documents to share." The room remained frozen as we walked to the main table. I pulled out Charles's chair for my father, Ruth's chair for my mother. They sat down slowly, as if expecting someone to stop them. No one did. "Now," I said, taking my own seat between them. "I believe someone mentioned dessert." The servers, who had been watching from the doorways, began to move uncertainly. "Bring it," I commanded with an authority I'd learned from watching Ruth all these years. "And use the good plates. The ones without chips." As the elaborate desserts were placed before us, creme brulee with perfectly caramelized tops, I saw James still standing, torn between his family and his wife. "Sit down, James," I said, not unkindly. "We need to talk about which side of this table you want to be on, literally and figuratively." He sat, but I could see the war raging behind his eyes. Around us, the room slowly came back to life. Quieter, subdued, charged with a new dynamic. The power structure had shifted, and everyone was trying to figure out where they stood in this new arrangement. Ruth hadn't moved from where she stood, her perfect composure finally, completely shattered. "You know what the really sad part is?" I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This could have been so simple. All you had to do was be kind. That's it. Just basic human kindness. But you couldn't even manage that." I picked up my spoon, tapping it gently against the caramelized sugar of my dessert. The crack was sharp, definitive. "So now," I continued, looking directly at Ruth, "we do this my way. And my way starts with you apologizing to my parents. On your knees, since you seem to think positioning matters so much." "I will never," Ruth began. "Never?" I asked, pulling up one last document on my phone. "Are you sure? Because this is the security footage from your office last week. You know, when you met with that federal investigator who's been sniffing around the foundation. The one you told Charles was just a routine inquiry? He seemed very interested in those offshore accounts. Should we see what else he might be interested in?" Ruth's legs gave out. She didn't kneel so much as collapse, catching herself on the edge of the table. The mighty Ruth Whitmore, brought low by her own cruelty and corruption. "I'm sorry," she whispered.
"Louder," I said.
"And to them, not to me." She turned to my parents, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." My mother, because she's a better person than any of us deserve, reached out and touched Ruth's shoulder gently. "It's okay," she said softly. "We forgive you." But I wasn't done. Not yet. "Forgiveness is theirs to give," I said. "But consequences are mine to deliver." The dessert course continued in surreal silence. The only sounds were the clink of spoons against china and quiet sobs from various corners of the room as the full implications of what I'd revealed sank in. We had reached the turning point. But this was far from over. The servers swept in with practiced precision, placing the creme brulee before each guest with delicate clinks against the mahogany table. I lifted my spoon and tapped the caramelized sugar surface. Crack. The sound cut through the suffocating silence like a gunshot. "Since we're all enjoying this beautiful dessert," I said, savoring the way I tracked my movements, "let's talk about what really makes something sweet. Is it the sugar? Or is it knowing you've earned the right to enjoy it?" I connected my phone to the dining room's built-in screen with a simple swipe. The Whitmores had installed the system for their insufferable slideshow presentations, photos from their European vacations, charity galas where they bought recognition with tax-deductible donations. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. The first image appeared, a timeline of transactions, dates highlighted in red, amounts circled in damning detail. Bradley, I said, turning to my husband's cousin, you were so proud of that Riverside property deal earlier. Let's examine it properly, shall we? The screen filled with email screenshots, each one timestamped, each one incriminating. Here's your first contact with Councilman Davies, 3 months before the property was listed. Here's the confidential memo about the rezoning proposal. And here, I paused, letting the image sink in, is your wife's signature on the shell company documents. Jennifer, you're not just complicit. You're the co-conspirator. Jennifer dropped her spoon, creme brulee splattering across her designer dress. That's not, we didn't. Didn't what? I asked pleasantly. Didn't think you'd get caught? Or didn't think the carpenter's daughter would be smart enough to understand financial fraud when she saw it? My father straightened in Charles's chair, and I saw something shift in his expression, pride mixing with a protective concern. He knew I was burning bridges that could never be rebuilt. Let's move on, I said, swiping to the next document. The Whitmore Foundation. Such a beacon of philanthropy. The sarcasm dripped from my words like honey from a spoon. Except here's the interesting thing about charitable organizations, they have to file public documents. Form 990s, for those following along. And when you analyze the payment patterns, a flowchart appeared on screen, arrows connecting the foundation to various LLCs, all leading back to family members. 40% of donations circled right back into Whitmore pockets, I announced. But here's the truly special part. I clicked to highlight a specific transaction. Last year's community development grant of $2 million went to renovate a building. Want to guess who owns that building? Ruth, still on her knees beside the table, whispered, "Stop. Stop." I echoed. Like you stopped when my mother asked for water and you made sure the servers ignored her? Like you stopped when my father tried to join your conversation and you laughed at him? I turned to address the room. She paid the catering staff, paid them extra, to humiliate my parents. There's an invoice. Would you like to see it? The invoice appeared on screen, Ruth's signature clear at the bottom, the note about special service requirements for corner table, highlighted in yellow. Margaret tried to stand, wobbling on her designer heels. This is illegal. You stole these documents. Actually, I said, pulling out a different document. Everything I'm showing was either publicly available, carelessly left unsecured, or directly shared with me in my capacity as James's wife. You made me a signatory on several accounts, remember? For convenience? That gives me legal access to all associated documents. I looked at the room's younger generation, the cousins in their 20s and 30s who'd watched this unfold with growing horror. How many of you knew? I asked them. How many of you sat at these dinners, watching the casual cruelty, the deliberate exclusion, and said nothing because it was easier? Because you didn't want to risk your inheritance. Sophia, Charles's youngest niece, barely 22, raised her hand tentatively. I tried to say something once about how we treated the Robinsons at Christmas. And what happened? I prompted. Aunt Ruth removed me from the trust fund distribution list for 6 months. Gasps around the table. Even among the complicit, that level of financial manipulation over a moral objection shocked them. Control through money, I said, nodding. The Whitmore way. I turned back to the screen. But what happens when the money itself is dirty? I pulled up a document that made Charles's white face go gray. This is an IRS inquiry from last week. They're very interested in some discrepancies between reported income and lifestyle expenses. Turns out, declaring only half your income while living like you have it all raises red flags. You sent that inquiry, Charles accused. No, I said simply. But I did respond to their request for information. As a concerned citizen. With documentation. My mother spoke up from Ruth's chair, her voice gentle but firm. Anya, vengeance isn't the answer. This isn't vengeance, Mom. I replied, never taking my eyes off the Whitmores. This is justice. They've spent decades stepping on people like us, secure in the knowledge that we couldn't fight back, that we wouldn't dare. I pulled up a video file. But my favorite piece of evidence is this. Ruth's voice filled the room, recorded from the security system 2 hours before dinner. Make sure those people understand their place. If her parents arrive early, keep them waiting outside until everyone else is seated. I want it clear from the moment they arrive that they're here on sufferance, not by right. The head server, standing in the doorway, went pale. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry. I didn't want to. It's not your fault, I told him.
You need this job.
They counted on that. I looked around the room. They count on everyone needing something from them. But what happens when someone doesn't? I stood, walking to where my father sat. Dad, remember what you told me when I was 16? When the Martins refused to pay you for that deck you built? He nodded slowly. That a person's true character shows in how they treat people they think they don't need. The Whitmores, I announced, think they don't need anyone. But they're wrong. I pulled up one final document for this course of revelations. This is a signed affidavit from Thomas Greenwood, senior partner at Greenwood, Harrison and Associates. He's prepared to testify about the informal conversation where Charles Whitmore offered him a bribe to deny a construction permit for a competing development. Thomas recorded that conversation. Charles stood abruptly, his chair crashing backward. That's a lie. Is it? I asked. Should we call Thomas? He's waiting in his car outside, happy to join us for dessert. The room erupted. Accusations flew between family members. Jennifer turned on Bradley, hissing about him dragging her into his schemes. Margaret's husband stood and walked out without a word. The younger cousins huddled together, trying to distance themselves from their elders' crimes. But I kept my eyes on Ruth, still on her knees, mascara streaming down her cheeks in black rivers. You want to know the real irony? I asked her. My parents would have forgiven everything. The coldness, the snubs, the little cruelties. They would have smiled and borne it all, just to make James happy, just to keep the peace. All you had to do was show them basic courtesy. A chair at the table. A plate without chips. A simple, welcome to the family. Ruth looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw her without her masks, an aging woman who'd built her entire identity on being better than others, now faced with the reality that she was so much worse. But you couldn't do it, I continued. Your need to feel superior was stronger than basic human decency. So now everyone knows what you really are. I turned to the room. I have copies of everything. Physical drives, cloud storage, and a lawyer holding a set with instructions to release if anything happens to me or my parents. So think very carefully about your next moves. I walked back to my seat between my parents, picking up my spoon again. The creme brulee had cooled, but I took a bite anyway, letting the sweetness dissolve on my tongue. Now, I said, who wants to discuss the scholarship fund my parents will be establishing? The one that will be funded by a very generous donation from the Whitmore Foundation? I have the paperwork right here. Ruth finally found her voice, though it came out cracked and desperate. This is extortion. You're destroying a family legacy over hurt feelings. Hurt feelings? I set down my spoon deliberately. Is that what you call systematic humiliation? And as for extortion, I'm not asking for anything for myself. Every penny will go to helping kids whose parents work with their hands achieve their dreams. The Thomas and Elena Peterson Endowment for Trade Excellence. I produced a folder from my bag, thick, official, prepared weeks ago when I first learned of this dinner. $5 million from the Whitmore Foundation. Enough to fund full apprenticeships for 50 students a year. My father will select the recipients. We'll never sign that, Charles sputtered. Won't you? I pulled up another email on my phone, projecting it for all to see. This is from the IRS investigator. He's very interested in having a conversation about the foundation's finances. I told him I'd get back to him after dinner. What should I say? James finally broke his silence, standing abruptly. Mom, did you really tell them to lock my in-laws outside? Ruth's silence was answer enough. Jesus Christ, James breathed. Anya's parents. My family. And you, he stopped, running his hands through his hair. I watched it happen. I sat here and watched it happen. You did. I agreed quietly. And that's something we'll need to address. But right now, your mother has a decision to make. An uncle I'd barely spoken to before, Richard, Ruth's younger brother, cleared his throat. Ruth, sign the papers. This has gone too far. You're taking her side? Ruth's voice pitched higher, hysterical. There are no sides anymore, Richard said firmly. There's only damage control. Sign the papers before she remembers she has more evidence to share. He was right. I did have more. So much more. Years of accumulated proof of their casual corruptions, their cruel dismissals of anyone deemed beneath them. Ruth struggled to her feet, joints protesting from her time on the floor. She walked unsteadily to the folder, picked up the pen I'd thoughtfully provided, and signed her name with shaking hands. Charles followed, his signature angry slashes across the page. There, Ruth spat. Are you satisfied?
Not quite, I said.
I turned to address the staff hovering in doorways. I need witnesses to something. The head server stepped forward, followed by 3 others. They'd been invisible all evening, as the Whitmores preferred their help to be. But they'd seen everything, heard everything. I want to establish new rules for any future gatherings, I announced. A dignity clause, we'll call it. No guest will ever be segregated based on perceived social status. No one will be served on inferior plates. No one will be made to sit in corners on folding chairs. And if anyone violates these rules, the staff has my personal number and my promise of legal support. I handed my business card to the head server. That includes protection from termination and guaranteed employment at comparable wages if needed. The server took the card with something like, "Aw. Thank you, ma'am." Don't thank me. Thank my parents. They taught me that everyone deserves respect. A younger cousin, Patricia, I think, suddenly stood. Aunt Ruth, you need to apologize properly. Not just sign papers. Really apologize. I did apologize, Ruth protested. No, Patricia said, finding courage in my example. You said words, but you didn't mean them. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson deserve better. More voices joined in, the younger generation, finally freed from their silence by the collapse of the old power structure. Apologize properly. On your knees again. Like you mean it this time. Ruth looked around wildly, seeking support, but found none. Even Charles had retreated, slumped in his displaced chair. She walked slowly to where my parents sat, each step seemingly painful. This time, when she lowered herself to her knees, it was deliberate, conscious. Mr. Peterson, she began, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Peterson.
Elena.
Thomas. I have been cruel. Unconscionably cruel. There's no excuse for how I treated you. I am deeply, genuinely sorry. My mother, because she has more grace than anyone I know, reached down and helped Ruth to her feet. We forgive you, she said simply. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. The consequences are just beginning, I added. I addressed the room again. The foundation will be restructured with a new board. Half the seats will go to community members, teachers, social workers, tradespeople. People who understand what charity really means. You can't, Margaret started. I can, I interrupted. Unless you'd prefer I forward those text messages about your pharmaceutical friend to the DEA. They take prescription fraud very seriously. Margaret fled the room, her husband's laughter following her, bitter, vindicated laughter from a man who'd been waiting for his chance at revenge. Anyone else? I asked the room. Any other objections to reform? Silence. The head server approached our table with a fresh bottle of champagne. The good stuff, I noticed, not the secondary label they'd planned to serve my parents. On the house, he said quietly, with the compliments of the staff. My father stood as the cork popped, and I watched him transform. The dejection was gone, replaced by the quiet dignity I'd known all my life. He raised his glass. To bridges, he said. The ones we build, the ones we burn, and the ones we choose to cross. We drank, the champagne sharp and bright on our tongues. Around us, the Whitmore empire crumbled in real time, phones buzzing with calls from lawyers, accountants, damage control specialists. But at our table, the real table, there was peace. James approached tentatively. Anya, can we talk? Tomorrow, I said. Tonight is for my parents. He nodded, understanding that our marriage, like everything else, would need to be rebuilt from the foundation up, or torn down entirely. The younger cousins began to drift over one by one, introducing themselves properly to my parents. Sophia brought her grandmother's vintage wine from the cellar, the stuff she saves for judges and senators, she whispered conspiratorially. Patricia asked my father about carpentry, genuinely interested in his work. Ruth watched from across the room, isolated in her humiliation. But I saw something else in her expression, a dawning recognition of what she'd lost, what she'd thrown away for the sake of her poisonous pride. Mrs. Whitmore, my mother called out. Would you like to join us? There's room at the table. The offer hung in the air, grace extended where none had been given. Ruth approached slowly, uncertainly, like someone learning to walk again. Thank you, she whispered as she sat. The thing about tables, my father said philosophically, is that they're meant to bring people together. The moment you start deciding who doesn't belong, you've forgotten the whole point. The party dissolved slowly, like sugar in water. Some fled immediately. Bradley and Jennifer, Margaret, those with the most to lose from exposure. Others lingered, uncertain, the social order that had defined their world suddenly inverted. I found myself in the study with my parents and the head server, Marcus, drafting the dignity clause on Whitmore letterhead. It would be signed by every family member before they left, or their secrets would find new audiences by morning. No guest shall be segregated or distinguished by perceived social or economic status, I read aloud. All attendees will be served with equal respect, quality, and attention. I looked at Marcus. What else? A provision about staff, he suggested quietly. That we can't be punished for treating all guests equally. Good. What else? Maybe, my mother suggested, something about apologies. That if harm is done, it must be acknowledged properly, not just papered over with money. We worked for an hour, creating a document that would govern all future Whitmore gatherings. It was revolutionary in its simplicity, demanding only what should have been given freely. James appeared in the doorway as we finished. Anya, please. 5 minutes. I looked at my parents. Dad nodded. We'll be here, sweetheart. I followed James to the garden, where the October air bit sharp and clean after the suffocating atmosphere inside. He stood by the fountain, the pretentious one with the Greek gods his mother had imported from Italy. I failed you, he began without preamble. I failed your parents. I failed us. Yes, I agreed. You did. I kept telling myself I was keeping the peace, that if I just stayed quiet, it would blow over. But I was a coward.
He met my eyes.
I was so afraid of losing my family that I forgot what family really means. And what does it mean, James? It means standing up for the people you love, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. He pulled out his phone, showing me an email he'd composed. This is my resignation from Whitmore Holdings. I'm done taking their money, following their rules. That's a start, I said carefully. But James, this isn't just about grand gestures. It's about daily choices. Every time you stayed silent when they insulted me, every time you laughed along with their jokes, every time you made excuses for them, those were choices. I know. His voice broke. God, Anya, I know. When I saw your parents in that corner, on those chairs, I've never hated myself more. Therapy, I said firmly. Individual and couples. Non-negotiable. Already booked. Dr. Morrison, the one you suggested last year. And your family? I'll handle them. Set boundaries. Real ones, with consequences. He paused. If you'll have me. If we can rebuild. I thought about the 5 years we'd shared, the good mixed with the bad. The man who'd held me when my grandfather died, who'd surprised me with weekend trips to obscure bookstores, who'd learned to make my mother's soup recipe when I was homesick. But also the man who'd let his family diminish me, chip away at my worth, hurt the people I loved most. We can try, I said finally. But James, if you ever stand by silently while someone hurts my family again, I won't. I swear I won't. We returned to find the main hall transformed. The younger generation had rearranged everything, the long, imposing table replaced by smaller, intimate rounds. My parents sat at the center of one, surrounded by cousins eager to hear my father's stories about building homes, my mother's experiences in the hospital. Ruth approached me tentatively. "The papers you have, what will you do with them?" "That depends on you," I said. "Change, real change, and they stay private. Continue the old patterns, and the world learns everything." "I don't know how to be different," she admitted, the words seemingly ripped from her throat. "Start by listening," I suggested. My mother-in-law, my real mother-in-law, the one I hope you could become, would have asked my parents about their lives, their dreams, their stories. She would have been proud to know people who built their life with their own hands. Ruth looked at my parents, really looked at them for perhaps the first time. "They are remarkable, aren't they? To have raised you, to have survived tonight with such dignity." "They are," I agreed. "And they would have loved you if you'd let them." The next morning, we held an emergency board meeting for the Whitmore Foundation. Half the old board resigned rather than face scrutiny. We replaced them with Marcus the server, Mrs. Chun from the local food bank, James Patterson, who ran a vocational training center, and my father. The first order of business was the Peterson Endowment. My father stood to address the room, his carpenter's hands steady on the podium. "This endowment isn't about charity," he said. "It's about investment. Investment in young people who want to build, to create, to work with their hands and their hearts. We'll fund apprenticeships, provide tools, cover living expenses, so they can focus on learning. But more than that, we'll give them dignity. The knowledge that their work matters, that they matter." The first scholarship recipient was announced a month later, Maria Santos, 17, whose father worked 3 jobs to keep their family afloat. She wanted to be an electrician. At the ceremony, she hugged my father and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." "Thank your daughter," he replied. She made sure we all got seen. Ruth attended that ceremony, sitting quietly in the back. Afterward, she approached my mother. "Elena," I wondered, "would you perhaps have coffee with me sometime? I'd like to learn about your life. Your real life." My mother, gracious as always, agreed. 6 months later, we hosted dinner at the Whitmore estate again. But this time it was different. The table was round. We'd had it specially made by a local craftsman my father recommended. There were no corner seats, no folding chairs, no chipped plates. Ruth, nervous but determined, served the meal herself, a simple pot roast she'd learned to make from my mother. It was slightly overcooked, the vegetables a bit soft, but she'd made it with her own hands. "It's delicious," my father said, and meant it. Charles had been quieter since that night, humbled by the ongoing IRS investigation that had resulted in significant penalties, but, thanks to cooperation, no criminal charges. He asked my father about a cabinet he wanted built, genuinely interested, genuinely respectful. The cousins shared stories of their own work. Patricia had started volunteering at the vocational center. Sophia was teaching literacy at the community center. The family wealth was being redistributed, slowly but surely, into the community that had built it. "You know what I've learned?" Ruth said suddenly, raising her glass of modest wine. "Tables aren't about who sits where. They're about making sure everyone has a place." "To that," my father said, raising his own glass, "and to the bridges we build between those places." We toasted, all of us, equals around a table that had finally learned its true purpose. Later, as we prepared to leave, I found the 2-place cards that had been set aside for my parents that first night, the ones meant for the folding chairs in the corner. I'd kept them as a reminder. But now, I threw them in the fire, watching the cardstock curl and blacken. The past could burn. The future we were building, together, equally, with dignity, that was worth preserving. "Ready to go home?" James asked, his hand finding mine. I looked back at the dining room where my parents were helping Ruth clear the table, laughing about something my mother had said. Where former servants and former masters worked side by side. Where the table had finally grown large enough for everyone. "Yes," I said. "Let's go home." As we drove away, I thought about the title my mother had given this story when I told her I was writing it down. They said my parents didn't deserve a seat at the table. By dessert, they were on their knees. It's not about revenge, she'd explained. It's about reversal. About how the mighty fall when their foundation is pride, and how the humble rise when their foundation is love. She was right, as usual. The Whitmores had built their table on exclusion, on the belief that worth could be measured in dollars and degrees. But tables built on such foundations always collapse eventually. Ours, the one we were building now, stood on stronger legs: respect, dignity, and the radical idea that every person deserves a place. And that table I knew would last. Have you ever stayed silent while watching someone you love being hurt, and what did that silence cost you? If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the moments that reveal who we really are when power meets principle.